welcome everybody to theme 3 of the ABC School. As in previous sessions, we'll do a brief introduction to the theme. We'll talk a little bit about today, and we'll do brief speaker introductions and then hand it off to the speakers.
So yeah, and welcome. We gather here today and we acknowledge from many locations, and we'll begin by acknowledging that the ground beneath our feet is historically the home of indigenous peoples, many of whom have been forced out or marginalized in their own territories. I personally am coming from New York City, the ancestral Lenape homelands, and New York City is also one of the places with the largest numbers of Native people today in the United States. Next, please. Slide. We also want to remind everyone of the community agreements with which we start all our sessions. Palmyra.
So just to recap themes 1 and 2, the intent of the first theme, capitalism, was to offer a foundational framing of how capitalism and its partner, colonialism, set the ideologies, relationships, and mechanism within which architecture ultimately operates. Our second theme, labor, zoomed in to investigate how capitalism shapes and is shaped by laborers of the built environment and the conditions that lead to their precarity, exploitation, insecurity, or invisibility. Our third theme, collectives, we're starting to hit at possible solutions and ways in which we can come together and through collective governance and even collective ownership, tackle many of the issues that have been brought up by speakers and by participants in past weeks. We also introduced a secondary concept, that of the commons and its associated practice of commoning, to guide not only today's speakers in their presentations, but also all of you as you navigate the upcoming assignment. So neither collectives nor commoning are a priori anti or post-capitalist constructs, but in some manifestations, they contain the possibility of resistance. As Stavros Stavridis tells us in one of today's required readings, for commoning practices to become important prefigurations of an emancipated society, commoning has to remain a collective struggle to reappropriate and transform a society's commonwealth by always expanding the network of sharing and collaboration. So in this session, we want to explore how groups of people, collectives, come together and organize themselves to manage common resources for individual and collective benefit, critically assess existing practices, and then speculate on how nascent models of alternative, possibly post-capitalist, collective governance may lead to a better, at the very least, a more equitable and just society. So today's 4 speakers will offer different but deeply interconnected perspectives on this topic.
And now we're going to explain a little bit of the sequencing of the session today. This 2-hour session will begin with 15-minute presentations by our invited speakers, followed by a self-led breakout group in our home bases to reflect, comment, and come up with a question or response for the speakers. After the breakouts, we will convene for a final discussion. Palmyra, would you briefly introduce us to our speakers?
Absolutely. And then in the chat, we will paste the link to the detailed bios because this will be a very brief introduction. Magali Sarfatti Larson is our first speaker. She's Professor Emerita of Sociology at Temple University and was Distinguished Professor at the University of Urbino in Italy. Today, she will revisit her story of the professions, first told in her 1977 seminal book, The Rise of Professionalism, and tell us why the architectural profession might be a collective but is not a community. Cristina Gamboa is a chartered architect and teacher. She's co-founder of La Col, a cooperative of architects established in Barcelona, and she's also a visiting lecturer at the RCA. She will reframe the role of the architect through the lens of cooperativism and also talk about forming connections to the surrounding communities. Garrett Jacobs is the Director of Advocacy and Strategic Partnerships and interim CFO of Designing Justice and Designing Spaces. He will bring us to the American context and discuss how systemic injustices can begin to be addressed by retaking ownership of the commons. And last but not least, Kofi Boone, FASLA, is a university faculty scholar and professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at NC State University in the College of Design. Today, he will speak about land, property ownership, control, and he will speculate about the Black Commons.
Welcome to all of you, and we are so honored to have you here for the collective session of our ABC School. As you will all bring a very specific discourse and practice to this theme, we're very excited that each of you have such a long history with this topic and different points of view, so I'm really excited. We will not be breaking between the talks or reintroducing you, so each of you should just step up after the previous speaker is finished. So Magali, please take it away.
Yes.
One quick note before you start, Magali. Magali, you've asked that your PowerPoint presentation is made available to all the participants. And so the link to that will be pasted in the chat as well. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Aaron. Thank you to Palmyra. Thank you to Quilian. And let me start with what I was trying to do when I studied professions. But a little story is that I was going to study architects who were trying to unionize in the Bay Area. And I was hearing, unlike what Aska and Kirti heard in London, I was hearing from my friends who were in this union effort that architects said, no, it's not professional to unionize. And I heard the same when I was on a teacher's strike twice. Twice I was on a university teacher's strike, and twice we were told that that was not professional. So I started wondering, well, what are these professions? And the first thing that was striking is that they changed very much after the rise of industrial capitalism, and they tried to assert themselves in the market. And this is what you see in England and the United States, and it's very different in continental Europe, and I won't talk about it, but it was one of the omissions in my book. I couldn't do everything. It started as a thesis, as a matter of fact. And so, as you see, they started with a wave of associations in the 19th century. In England, most of the recognized professions organized, I was going to say unionized, from 1825 to 1880, and in the United States from 1840 to 1887 next. And the fact is that, what did they want? They were seeking, I argued, that was my central thesis, and you see it in the other slide, but they wanted to establish a structural link, I argued, between certified training and credentials and a sheltered, protected position in the market, a better position than just being exposed to endless and raging competition, of course, which was very high, especially in medicine and also in the law. So this structural link, I would argue, is essential in the definition of a profession. If it starts weakening, the profession has trouble recruiting. Therefore, it has trouble reproducing itself. And as I argued, and I'm adding these things now, the professions to attract recruits had to promise certain advantages. And these advantages were very much vested in the individual. They produce producers, if you want. And I think that the idea of a professional career has a strong individualist component, which we find difficult to master or to counteract. Now, the anti-market elements come in because the professions had to convince, to persuade their public, which was essentially the bourgeoisie or the middle classes, if you want, and the principles of rationality that now would be used, an appeal to science and an appeal to the power of education, were not available. There was no such thing as public education, especially not at an upper level. And so I showed that these professions introduced anti-market, anti-capitalist elements, traditional elements, not the famous ideal service that sociologists and professionals themselves are always banding about, and for which there is no evidence. There is no evidence that professionals have more of a service idea than any other workers. But there is evidence that they're less indifferent to their work. They want their work to be interesting. It's the intrinsic value of work goes together with the notion of calling that links the individual to what she or he does. So these are the anti-market elements that one can trace. An effort to find work that is intrinsically interesting. And there are other elements as well, such as fees graduated according to income, which are non-market, if you want. They come from a traditional sphere. And it's in that sense that professions next might be considered communities. But let me tell you first that I made a lot of mistakes, a lot of omissions, but one that I had at least the capacity to rectify afterwards was stressing that the discursive authority which professions claim, the authority to define the field in which they operate, think of medical specialties, which keep defining fields, or think of architects trying to define what is good architecture. That discursive authority is very important to cement some unity inside the profession, but also to create a public image of the profession in the mind of the public, precisely. And I would argue that if the image of the profession is not clear in the mind of the public, then it has less claims, less authority, and fewer claims to authority that can be established. So next. The questions that we were going to see today is whether professions exist as communities, as collectives. Do they have an affinity with the commons, therefore? And finally, we'll talk about architecture, about which you all know more than I do. So let's start with the communities. Well, sociologists love that. Next, a sociologist called William Good, way back in 1957, started with an article that had very little empirical base, telling us that professions are communities. They share, he said, a binding sense of identity. And this sense of identity is lasting because when people enter training and enter a profession, they're not that likely to leave it. Therefore, that status as professional is continuing. And as I told you before, it's very much vested in the individual. They share values, he said. Well, maybe. I think they share discursive authority and the notion of what their field of operations is. And he also argued that the role definitions they have for members and non-members are always the same, which is not true. I mean, there's no proof for that you address the same role definition to an elite architect and to an architectural worker, even though she or he may be just licensed as much as the boss. Okay. What they have is a common language, that is true, and the professionals, as you all know, like to speak that common language, like to speak, to talk shop, right? And outsiders don't communicate as well in that field. So actually, this is, well, I'm not even following my slides, but I think that this community is particularly not visible in architecture. But the collectivity has power over its members, it has clear limits, and especially produces the next generation of professionals next. And now, why is it important to consider a profession as a community? Well, whatever is communal in a profession then marks it as a good field for the commons. And I would argue that the definition of the field through the discursive authority of the profession constitutes something common. It is a way of constituting a commons or a part of the commons. Also, that the professions are community marked them for Elliot Friedson, who was a great sociologist of medicine, as the third logic. What he called the third logic was professionalism as a different way of organizing labor than the market or a bureaucracy. You organize it professionally with some sort of collectivity. Well, I'm not going to go back here to my critique of Friedson, but I think that that too can be criticized because most professionals today live in bureaucracies. Even architects live, the architects that work in the very large firms are working in a bureaucratic context. Now, the commons, as you know, I'll go very quickly through this because you know it. The commons are common pool resources, starting with air, that is always worse, water, that is always in danger of being privatized, especially in the global south. And land, which until enclosures started in 16th century Europe, land was and still is in some places common. But of course, the movement of enclosures, as you know, triumphed in the 19th century. Now, the commons reemerged in scholarly discussion through a famous article by an ecologist, not even an economist, but Garrett Hardin in 1968. I had to speak about that for a moment because he spoke about the tragedy of the commons, which was what? If you have common pool of resources open to all, they're going to be depleted. There's no way around it. Well, that was very you can criticize immediately because even if you start cutting trees, you could replant them. But for him, the tragedy of the commons was the depletion of resources, and what could fix it? Of course, only private property. Now, a political scientist called Elinor Ostrom, that most of you know about, Ostrom got the Nobel Prize and not Hardin, the Nobel Prize of Economics, started looking at the reality of the commons in Africa and in Latin America in particular. And the reality of the commons is that the users of the commons can self-organize and, as she said, escape the tragedy of overuse. Now, I'm not going to go through Elinor Ostrom's 8 principles. You will read them and you will see that they spell what we all want: democracy and equality, and they aim at maintaining the commons. Therefore, they aim at sustainability. Next slide. Okay, these are Ostrom's principles, and I give you only the principal things about them. Now, next, we can talk about architecture now. And you will stop me when I get too close to my time. Architecture has humble origins and also very lofty origins. But from the Middle Ages, the profession emerges as mediating the enormous tasks of construction that were undertaken in a communal way by very skilled craftsmen. And then in the Renaissance, it changes. And because architecture discovers a new style and theorizes the new style and offers it to powerful patrons, it is the part of the construction field with powerful patrons that emerges as new architects. And they have now, as a matter of fact, a base on which to academicize, a base on which to establish the training and the production of producers. And you know that gave, in Europe at least, it gave birth to royal academies. So what do they offer? They offer to powerful patrons, architects do, they offered an aesthetic view of construction and a philosophical view of construction as well, if you want. Architects appropriate the telos of building, the purpose of building, and unfortunately for them, they begin to leave the techne, the construction itself, to the engineers who are also rising. And from the beginning, engineers are going to be their main rival group in the field of construction. But architecture, the new architecture of the Renaissance, emerges in cities, very largely, building cities and building fortifications, military fortifications. And I point this out because I think that there are moments in which the profession of architecture, which is not yet the profession, attempts to redefine itself. And it does this with a vision of what buildings and beautiful buildings should be. One time is in the Renaissance, and then the big turn is in the 1920s and 30s with European modernism, and it spread throughout the world. Next. So now, this profession is not very successful, as I implied, in its market project. It doesn't conquer sheltered positions. It shelters the title. People who have not gone through the training process in most of our societies do not have the right to call themselves architects. But the competition is fierce, not only from engineers, but from land surveyors. And then in recent times, as Kofi in particular would tell you, from the competition that architects entertain with landscape architects and sometimes with interior designers is also very serious. But I think that despite this market weakness, you could say, the weakness on the market, and the continuous dependence on patrons, on commissions, where the client has authority and where you find an asymmetric power, because the architects have in no way the same power as their client. That's why I must, if I may digress a moment, I find what Gary Stevens has said in the Favorite Circle relatively absurd. First of all, his binary division of architecture into elites and subordinate masses is insulting and ridiculous, and he completely cancels the firm where architecture is done and continues with the delusion that we have gifted individuals who do all the design and who conceive of the design by themselves. Gifted individuals were mostly men at that point. Also, Gary Stevens, in that particular, in that book, if he tells us that we have to consider the whole field of architecture with critics and galleries and teachers, of course, since academia is very important as an organizational base, but he doesn't tell us we have to include the clients. And architects know better than me to what extent the clients have the last word and must be included. So I would argue that the discursive authority of architecture is undeniable. It continues presenting architecture as an art. And I think that even though this power is quite ambiguous, it is a power that maintains the unity of the architecture as a profession or as a calling in the mind of the public. You know, the people in general have an idea of what architects are, even though they don't know what they do exactly, and they don't know to what extent building is really constrained. Next. Okay. Here we are. We have architects who have given themselves a role definition and a base at different moments in history, and an organizational base in the training centers. And up to this day, you see that architects often mix academia with practice in their in the development of their careers. And the academia is very important. But what do these gatekeepers in academia, these elites, recognize? Well, do they recognize talk? Yes, they do, of course. But do they recognize paper projects? Yes. And architectural competitions have been an important way for architects to make themselves known, even though they don't build. But most of all, they recognize built projects. And here you have some of those projects, which are weird, according to President Xi of China. That's what he said of the Rem Koolhaas building. It's very weird, and we should stop building weird things. Well, Foster City Hall is also weird, then let's let Zaha Hadid alone, because you have here her Aliyev Center, about which we can talk a moment later, but that was something that projected her to great fame. And of course, these are buildings that are all but seeking to enter into their context. They are buildings that are there to be icons, to be remembered in and of themselves without nothing around them. And what is their importance? It may be, although I know that Quilian disputes this, and he's right, it may be what attracts recruits to architecture. But in any case, and I showed that in my book on architecture, when architecture in general is very fragmented and doesn't produce things that resemble, like that can tell you, oh, that's an architect designed building, the profession is in trouble, and it has to enlarge the definition of itself, especially because the field in which this happens tends to be academia. And I would talk about academia as a space of freedom, ultimately, although I know very well that, especially in the United States, it's reserved to the happy few because it's so expensive to go to school. And even in places where university education is free, the recruitment reflects and reproduces the inequality of the society in which it occurs. But I wanted to point out that the recognition of built projects forces the elites, the gatekeepers of the profession, to be tolerant and to recognize all sorts of things that are built if they want to maintain a relevance. Next. And I think we are almost done. Next slide, please. Well, that's what I just said. Next again. Well, so what can we say about the professional identity that architects are elaborating? I think that it has changed. We may be in a period in that 1920s and 1930s in which architects redefine their position with regard to the clients and their position with regard to what architecture means. And I think that the commons in which architects operate are very clear to see if you think about cities. The iconic projects are part of what Michel de Certeau called the city of panoramas, right? They change the skyline. They, in a sense, care very little about context. They are the context. They themselves create it. We don't know if they are public or private, or they are a facade. And so it's rare that we are shown their interior, even in architectural magazines. But there's another city. There is a city from the ground up. There is a walking city. And there are, like the first project here by Francis Diébédo-Quéré, the surgical clinic in Burkina Faso, I think it is. There are also projects in rural communities where nobody of importance lives, okay? And you see these projects which have been recognized, including Alejandro Aravena, who got the Pritzker Prize later with his very important idea of incremental building. And I don't want to spend too much time with this. You see also the funicular in Caracas that links the slums to the means of transportation. And let's go to the last slide. I think that architecture, as it moves towards a wider paradigm, it recognizes various forms of commons. And maybe we can go to the very last slide and we'll return to it. The commons that architecture serves are, first of all, I would say, constituting itself as a profession that cares about the city as commons, that recognizes the slum dwellers as villagers, which is something that Brian Burg of Urban Think Tank proves with his little film on Mumbai, and also serving rural communities that are not important, if you want, but that have many needs, serving public needs, making buildings as public goods, and also constituting new forms of practice about which others will talk much better than me. And in these new forms of practice, constituting new teams with clients that are not the traditional clients and with whom the relationship is not asymmetric, but tends to be much more egalitarian. The architect enters into the community. I think that the architects who work with Slum Dwellers International and the architects about whom Garrett can speak so much better than me, the architects in Design for Humanity, Architecture for Humanity, and other such organizations, the architects that look for sustainability and upgrading of the urban villagers cannot be like the star architects. They're different. They're people who are integrated into different teams. And I think I have talked enough. Did I much exceed my 15 minutes?
A little bit.
But
it was all worth it.
I apologize.
So I'm starting now. I'm sharing my screen. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an incredible pleasure to be here and bringing a bit about our experience in the professional field. So As Palmyra has also said, I'm one of the co-founders of La Col, a cooperative established in 2014 in Barcelona. But I thought it was interesting also to just kind of introduce a bit about the history, and basically because the project began in 2009 when, as students, we rent this space as a workspace, a space for kind of sharing days, nights, and infrastructure during the final part of the degrees. But also it was a space of discussing about the role of the architect in the middle of the beginning of the economical crisis in Barcelona. So basically, La Col was founded by 14 members following the cooperative form, because basically it was this legal framework that allows to share these needs, basically this platform to develop a professional activity in a stable and decent way, following kind of a shared values linked to the social economy. And basically nowadays we are part of a cooperative hub, La Comunal, so we are part of this social economy framework and market in working and with intercooperation with other kind of disciplines and projects, trying to in a way implement kind of these new economies in the city of Barcelona. And after almost 10 years of trajectory, we had just basically discussed about our goals. And basically we realized that we are aiming to generate community infrastructures for the sustainability of life in the broadest way possible, from social, economic, environmental, and understanding also how these infrastructures that we use as projects, initiatives, institutions in neighborhoods led by the communities are tools for eco-social transitions. And the way that we work is through architecture with the values of cooperativism and the participation of the communities that are linked to this, to the places. So in a kind of really trying to compact what are kind of the goals of what we try to do. And this is something that we basically learned from the place that we came from, Sans, this working neighborhood. And basically this was a neighborhood with a strong history of cooperativism and associations. And basically the cooperativism in the last century was the collective solution for the needs of the workers, of basically at the beginning just as a kind of a cooperative of consumers to have affordable food, and basically became physical institutions and structures of sociability in the neighborhoods, basically sharing this need of food, but suddenly starting to producing, to manage, but also generating funds and being able to provide a certain kind of welfare program, also such as education, elderly kind of supports, economical supply when strikes, etc., etc. So through different kind of cooperatives of consumers in each of the streets, the neighborhoods started to articulate themselves, and also with even the agriculture fields, etc., etc. So it was a moment also even as emancipation from a kind of a strong, even capitalism moment of revolution in the cities. And this kind of gymnastics of practices of organization made also possible certain moments of social revolution, such as in the 36 in Barcelona. So for us, it was also really important to understand these spaces kind of as a thresholds to start certain kind of social dynamics that for us has a kind of a potential of growing and scaling this kind of autonomy. And basically, these are kind of ideas and references that we try to bring with our work. So basically, with this question about how our work engage with the notion of commons in a city with huge and incredible effects of capitalism, gentrification, tourism, and the idea is how we can, through cooperative infrastructures, through kind of cooperative neighborhoods, so dealing from what is close around you based on the basic needs to a common city, basically to understand how we can establish structures of resilience. And we started with a practice also as students linked to the experience of Camballo, which is this formal industrial area that we see here in the photo, which basically the neighborhood was claiming for this to become public with infrastructures for more than 30 years. And basically it was an opportunity to suddenly went from the theory to the practice, from claiming to building by the people self-managed. So Camballo became a paradigmatic experience of a bottom-up transformation of the city. And we had the opportunity as students becoming architects to got involved in the assembly in different spaces and working spaces, also linked to architecture and the transformation, and basically allows us to learn how can we engage. So the role of the architect, establishing alternative protocols of provision of architecture at the same time of design, construction, and management of the urban space. And basically to understand how these kind of processes, the time, the strategies, the collective work, the tools, the materials, the legitimacy in a way builds the community and the identity, and how this was a scaling, arriving to became, as I was saying, part of the neighborhood with several projects that goes from food supply, culture, economies, housing, etc. But what it was even more important, this idea that it was a new agreement between the municipality who recognized the power and the capacity of the citizenship to manage the space. So this was kind of a new protocol also of kind of public management and the recognition of the community and the commons in between kind of the public and the market, or even kind of this third sector. And in the framework of Camballo, dealing with this idea of collective response to individual needs, two projects came, the cooperative housing, that basically is also again to redefine which is also our role, that it's not only about designing, it's also about even thinking and looking for references in terms of housing policies, and in a way going in parallel to the communities. So in that case, basically a group of neighbors organize to try to establish a new model of housing provision, a new model which basically wants to deal against the private home ownership established in Spain, and trying to introduce, as I was saying, this third sector as a model in a way to battle the speculation that we have in Barcelona. So this is a model based on a non-profit collective ownership and right of use, which is also producing affordable and inclusive and sustainable housing. So it was again to define kind of this process of definition of the architecture in parallel of the development itself, realizing how the characteristics of the model, self-development, collective ownership, community interaction, sustainability, and affordability has a huge impact also in terms of the architectural definition, being a space of experimentation, of innovation, challenging many of the limits of the private development of collective housing. And basically, so again, this idea that it was a model that became an opportunity to develop architecture in other parameters and standards. And it's now an opportunity for the people also to introduce new protocols even of care in the middle of this kind of pandemic times. No, so it's again the capacity of the society of establish their own links and mutual help dynamics. And this is because also kind of the instrumentality of architecture, and also how the ownership of this kind of new model of ownership is also challenging many of the kind of I would say of the kind of the social dynamics linked to the domestic realm. And this first project of La Borda, which came from Camballo, became also a polis. So the municipality understood also the power of this kind of experiences, and it was introduced in the Barcelona Housing Plan to 2016-2055, allowing also to develop new projects with new architects, new communities in other neighborhoods, basically trying to increase as much as possible the non-speculative and affordable stock of housing in the city of Barcelona, and also nowadays trying to challenge and trying to think which are the opportunities from plots to existing buildings with inhabited buildings to kind of a dispersed cooperative, because basically we understood it as a way to the right from the right to housing to the right of the city. And this is something that it's also being replicated outside Barcelona in Catalonia. And also it's, again, an opportunity of systematization, but also of knowledge transfer in order to not become a closed experiences, in order to become a real open model. No? And the other project that came, so in one hand, developing infrastructures of housing, because it's one of the main problems in the city. In the other hand, trying to extend the social economy in as much fields as possible. And this project, Coopolis, it was a social economy incubator managed by the community of Can Batlló, by the neighborhood, plus the municipality. So it's, again, it was always this kind of co-production of policies, and also, again, these new models of, I would say, even public cooperative communitarian management. And this was basically a space to learn about cooperativism, to start the initiatives about even from energy to food education, etc., etc. You know, trying to bring as much of a spaces also, again, you know, to control in the daily realm. And this became a kind of a device, a tool that it's been also replicated to other areas of Catalonia. Nowadays, there are 8 poles, 8 incubators managed by their own communities, and the nodes and of the social economy are spread in the territories. And this has a huge impact in all the territory, because basically it's, again, this idea to establish this kind of device, which can allow us to provide information and knowledge, and this also allows to grow these economies in the different territories. And where we are now, basically, has been that there is a reality of the management of Can Batlló with this kind of a specific agreement of citizenship heritage that the municipality has recognized, and the municipality has established a management of 50 years by the community of the area after developing the first experience of a cooperative housing, and now which this has become a polis after the idea of devices that allows to increase cooperativism in a really capitalistic city, how can you scale it up? So which kind of new protocols of urban transformation in a bigger scale can we develop? And what is also more interesting in terms of the environmental and the climatic situation that we have, which kind of new models of energy management can we establish? Also became Can Batlló itself as an energy community, but also this allows to share the resources. And this is what we are working right now, thinking in different vectors from water, biodiversity, food, energy, materials, etc., etc., taking in consideration, again, the participation and the social economy as the framework where we work, and analyzing the territories in a kind of a metabolistic analysis where the resources can be shared and new protocols, as I was saying, can be produced to make a more sustainable and equal or kind of democratic city. So where it's more or less, I think almost 15 minutes. So I will leave it here and we can discuss later. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. So I need a minute to take that in, Cristina. That was beautiful. The way that you use projects as pilots to then change policy and scale. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Garrett Jacobs. I'm going to now try to follow that up. Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm going to be sharing a couple examples from my experience with the Open Architecture Collaborative and Designing Justice Designing Spaces around kind of my perception of the commons as shared places and shared spaces, and place being physical space and space being a space of information and knowledge, and trying to put it in the context that I've experienced it in the US, where the commons, whoever defines it, really determines who is common and who is not, and how that's actually used as an othering term for who can kind of control the rules and the norms of the commons. Taking an example by, kind of what's happening in Detroit, where we see one developer who, is buying up a lot of the property and essentially creating a private security workforce. And so while it's public land, it's privately patrolled and secured. And what does that mean in terms of access and equity for what is termed the commons? And the questions that I've been trying to approach in my work is really, how do we redefine the definition of the commons to actually be equitable and inclusive, so that everyone can partake in them, both the sharing of knowledge and resources and access to space in an equitable way. So I'm sorry, Magali, this is the only image I have of Architecture for Humanity, but I'm going to share the kind of beginning story from this, because after that organization closed, we had to figure out what to do with all the people that were volunteering around the world with the mission of doing community-based architecture and providing services and resources to kind of redefine who has access to our knowledge, skills, and kind of doors that we can open in the bureaucracies. And so in 2015, it was my role working with the architects in the chapters all over the world. And we kind of, after the organization closed, we figured out, do we want to continue moving together? What is the kind of commons of the organization that we're going to carry forward? Do we even have enough shared values to do that? So representatives from around the world spent a year every Sunday defining whether we wanted to do something in collaboration to share the knowledge we'd accumulated over the years together or not, or whether we wanted to operate independently. So this was before the time of COVID. We were able to use Zoom and build up our skills before the pandemic. And we spent a year redefining our values, our mission, what we wanted to focus on, and how we would operate together and share knowledge. And it was really about taking this group of folks around the world in their individual chapters who hadn't really collaborated to figure out if we wanted to move together as a commons, as a shared network, to move forward. And the real focus was about having the one thing that brought us together not be the projects themselves, but about the people. And how can, one overarching entity, if it does support the work of individual chapters, not focus on doing projects, but on supporting the people in the network. And really the challenge was about how to move from this kind of headquarters approach to volunteer chapters around the world of everyone doing the work, which is a little bit more top down, or rather unorganized, because it was really people just doing the work on their own without any accountability, to a more networked version where essentially there's a support realm for operating the commons and allowing people to share knowledge and information. And so with that, we rebranded, we opened the Open Architecture Collaborative as that means, that organization that would support the work on the ground, so that people are not traveling around the world doing work, but focusing on work in their backyard and focusing on building communities around the projects. But after we started operating that for about a year, we really came to the idea that it was kind of too common. And the regional leadership structure and all the governance we built to kind of manage the commons, it failed. It didn't work. And people really just wanted to focus on their work locally and didn't have the capacity to really share the knowledge nationally or globally. And so some of the ideas that we started coming up with is because there wasn't enough of a defined identity to bring people together to really show up in the common space. And people were also asking for trainings and guidance on how to do the work. And so what we did was we kind of took those ideas and we developed a curriculum about how to explore identity within systems and within the commons so that it was more defined. And so, right, in order to really have commons be equitable, how do we confront our identities in the space so everyone has the shared power and ability to take action in the commons and with shared assets and resources? And so we began building a curriculum. This is in partnership with my colleague Shalini Agrawal, and kind of experimenting. We did a small initiative in West Oakland where we did 6 projects that we would gather together designers and train them in various techniques and tactics, all about exploring identity, about race, about power, about showing up in space, in community, to have a shared base of values so that when we redefine the commons this next time around, we can really see ourselves in the space. And so out of that came 6 projects, but really it was about the relationships between the designers and the community members who led the projects themselves. And so out of this experiment in 2017, we created the Pathways to Equity program as a means of calling people in and redefining what the commons would really be about. And instead of just community design or humanitarian design, it was about understanding identity within the racialized context of architecture and design in the US. And we did so by really creating a framework of trainings and education, shared knowledge around understanding the implications of identity and race, really getting at systemic issues instead of doing projects as ways to address the symptoms of the issues, and really learning to lead with relationships and allowing the projects to emerge from that. And really what happened, in this larger cycle that I'm starting to see is that we defined the commons very broadly so everyone could participate with their different beliefs of what it was that drew them together. We tried to operate that, but it didn't work because it was too vague. People weren't really seeing themselves within the larger context of what the commons was that we were defining. And so we worked to redefine how to really incorporate their identities into the work. And then we redefined what the program was. And so we kind of initiated a new calling in, an invitation and a facilitation of this commons with the core values of racial awareness, identity awareness, leading with relationships in order to affect systematic change in the built environment in the US. And so that was about here. And right now we're kind of going on our second loop of the cycle as what is now this Pathways to Equity Commons, which is, a whole new network of people, and what is the Open Architecture Collaborative Network of Commons, which is kind of a legacy network from Architecture for Humanity. And in doing so, in the past 2.5 years, the outcomes of rebuilding this cooperative infrastructure has been, 180 people going through programs, 44 people in fellowships, a whole network of trainers and facilitators, and really trying to figure out what this means as a cooperative business. So now we have all these people that are grounded in identity and can clearly be proud of their place in a more shared space. And what's coming out of it is that by focusing on relationships, we're having projects emerge that people are collaborating on. And now the project partners are coming back to us, wanting to hire us for further work, right? And you have 3 of those examples with Native American Health Center in West Oakland, kind of coming back to us wanting more architectural services. And so as an organization, how do we procure the staff from within the program participants? So there'll be one former fellow working on that project for that organization. We have a group of fellows that were doing community benefits agreements research for the Oakland Athletics Stadium in West Oakland. And then they established their own organization to help organize the community to establish a community benefits agreement for the new stadium in West Oakland. And they're being paid out of a community pool that the A's pay into. So again, more job opportunities that are coming out of these really identity-based and relationship-based convenings. And thirdly, there's a county government in the south of San Francisco in San Mateo County that hired us to do kind of a small fellowship within the county of governments. And so again, replicating the model of leading with relationships and people and identity to create a new cooperative way of doing work. And they're working with a community organization that had a pretty bad relationship with the county, and we're providing this framework to reestablish that. And again, we're hiring former fellows to help facilitate this next round of work. So while it's not large scale project based, it's slowly reframing how we build projects into relationship, because identity is so important in the work in the context in the US. Here are just some quotes from people going through the program. And Magali, it's really speaking to some of the issues you mentioned earlier about how people see or don't see the profession as a community. But when we reframe the collective action around relationships and around identity, people are now starting to realize that they're not alone in the work they want to do. They can be seen as marginalized members of a community that architecture in the US and writ large often does. And they can figure out how to collaborate together to find new forms of business. And we're really at the beginning stages of what this means, but it was about kind of reframing how we work together, how we approach projects in a more equitable fashion. So again, kind of redefining the collaborative, so it's not one person defining it and then, or one system defining it, but rather we're defining it together and allowing for the emergent outcomes to drive what new business comes out of it. So with that, I'm going to shift to designing justice, designing spaces. And this is kind of, I think, my own personal work in diving deeper into identity and knowledge sharing, because we're working to end the systems of mass incarceration in the United States by addressing the root causes, such as poverty, racism, unequal access to resources historically, and the criminal justice system itself. And we're architects, real estate developers, community organizers, and advocates together, because we know it's going to take a forward and proactive approach to establishing the new prototypes, just like Cristina established in her presentation and her work, to really show what's possible in creating new systems of reinvestment in community, restorative justice within how we treat each other, and new models of collaborative ownership. And so we're focusing our energy not about making the current system better, but about building a new system and pilots within that new system to show what's possible. You have examples of redefining city jails on the bottom left, which we did in Atlanta. You have the country's first Center for Restorative Justice and Restorative Economics on the bottom left, which is Restore Oakland. And you have which is co-ownership. So a few different organizations own that building together. And then that pilot was replicated in Detroit in the top right with the Love building. And now we'll be developing a Love campus. So essentially a transformative justice center in Detroit. But what I really wanted to talk about was, our model of bringing ideas to prototypes, evaluating them and replicating them, again, much like Cristina has also talked about, within the three buckets of work of restorative reinvestment, restorative reentry, and repurposing and reimagining current justice architecture. But the project I really want to talk about is the Pop-Up Resource Village. And this is an effort to collaboratively take back ownership of shared spaces and public spaces that are termed blighted in the United States, which is a highly racialized term within the planning department, to take resources out of communities. And how can we bring resources back together in a collaborative way and actually celebrate Black and African diasporic culture as a means of, again, redefining identity within space to establish a new cooperative and collaborative to the commons that is actually equitable and not exclusionary. And so what we've been doing is essentially addressing some of the key issues of public space in the US, which, you know, oftentimes people do not have equal access to public space because of territories, because of how they're feared of being treated. You know, people don't have public great access to resources, and they can't even get to the main core services that they need. And so how do you address some of these boundaries that are legal or not by celebrating space and culture? And so we're talking about how to pop up different resources within space to do so. And that's what the pop-up resource village is. And we're trying to do so in West Oakland, in East Oakland, and in Bayview Hunters Point, all traditionally African, well, not traditionally, but historically African-American neighborhoods that are really have been marginalized over the past 20, 30 years. And what we're doing is creating a village, right? All the different aspects of what goes into a village. And we're trying to create therapeutic environments where new entrepreneurs can get access to markets and actually, you know, have these beautiful spaces by which they're displaying their goods in as they're developing new skills to come to market. And we're building and designing all the infrastructure to house that, like you see here, the women's refuge trailer and the self-determination bus, which provides education to different neighborhoods. And these are the different hoods. And so we're kind of starting to define who the co-owners of this space will be and how they'll cooperate. So we have health and wellness, we have retail, arts and culture, food and agriculture, we have our youth future zone, and the space that DJDS ultimately wants to sit in is the design and operations of the physical infrastructure. And so the idea is that each one of these hoods will be owned by a different organization or entity that will kind of share the responsibility of bringing in resources and funds and operating the collective reactivation of the space. These are some of our core partners. But one thing I wanted to touch upon really quickly is the difficulty in talking about finances when you bring shared resources together and shared ownership of operations, because that has been incredibly difficult. And we're trying to figure out ways of talking about how the funds get distributed, how people bring them in and how they operate them. But again, this is kind of that shared knowledge. It also goes with shared operations, because if you want to really share things, you have to figure out how to maintain and manage them. And so, you know, we're essentially on our third iteration of this, which follows kind of that same cycle that I talked about. With the first pass was really establishing the village, building the infrastructures, doing community engagement to design them and brand it. And we worked with larger institutional partners that could bring in more resources, that had political connections and the capacity for managing the programs. But what we found out is that trying to operate this cooperative model within a capitalist structure and within the nonprofit mindset was really hard. So the larger institutions ultimately couldn't dedicate their resources because of a nonprofit industrial complex really wouldn't let people collaborate. Their budgets couldn't fit into a model of a collaborative budget, and people kind of stopped showing up. So then we pivoted and we focused on community-based organizations as the anchor partners to each one of those neighborhoods. They have better access to their community members, are really committed to the mission, and there's an opportunity for growth if they pool their resources together, that they can all go after larger funding and participate in larger events together and grow. However, there was kind of a lack of capacity to really manage the program. Again, the nonprofit industrial complex set in, not because of the operations of larger institutions not being able to shift, but because the smaller organizations were used to just working for the nonprofits and getting a check and not participating in the actual discussion about money management and shared ownership. So that became kind of a barrier to entry, and we couldn't get access to enough funding. So our third pass is, again, really defining the work in an identity. So this is not just a pop-up resource village with all those different hoods. It has all those hoods, but it's focused on African-American pregnant women in the Bayview neighborhood of San Francisco, because the mortality rate in the Black community is much lower than in the white community in the Bay Area and writ large in the US. So how can we provide all the assets and all the resources of the village while focusing on building the mortality rates of the African-American community in San Francisco? And so this time around, we have both an institutional partner and a community partner for each one of those hoods. So in this one, it's University of San Francisco has an initiative that's taking on the health and wellness, but they also have Rafiki Health and Wellness Collaborative, which is a community-based organization. So each one of the hoods has partners within larger institutions that can bring in funds and community-based institutions that can bring in kind of some of the community-based approach. We just did our first event last Saturday. It was very successful. We're seeing a lot more funding come in. We're seeing a lot more bureaucratic institutions participate. And now we're going to run it for 12 events over the course of a year to see how it turns out. At the same time, the ideal is that we're shifting the pop-up resource village out of designing justice, designing spaces, and making it a cooperative business in and of itself, so that each one of those hoods is cooperatively owned. Again, lots of challenges there, happy to go into in questions, but how do we shift that again and really redefining it the way that it works to be more successful in the shared resources? Just some of the outcomes that we've seen, from placemaking to business development, improve safety in the neighborhoods, access to social services, and economic opportunity. Okay, those were my examples. Sorry, that was pretty quick. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you. That was awesome. I will speak very quickly. I apologize for the speed. You've gotten a lot of great presentations. You can see the threads being connected. In my case, I'm going to focus more on what's called the Black Commons for the purposes of this conversation. So I'm going to move forward.
Sorry to interrupt, but feel free to take your time. We'll skip the breakout sessions and just go into discussions. So take the full time that you need.
Okay. Shorter is better. That's a whole story I have with my students about the elevator pitch. If you can't say it in half the time, then I'm not really thinking about it. So thank you. It's good to be with you all. We're coming through the aftermath of the twin pandemics, and people are maybe asking what the other pandemic is other than COVID. And it is the racial reckoning that occurred after the summer of 2020 that challenged a lot of the frameworks and systems and ways of thinking about how our society moves forward globally. So in addition to the public health tragedy that's occurring all over the world, we were enlightened, many of us, tragically through the murder of George Floyd, that there were huge underlying disparities that had not been addressed for some time. And so that's the other part of the twin pandemics that sets sort of the context of this. And in thinking about that as an academic, primarily working with a colleague, Julian Edgemon, who's at Tufts University, teaches planning, we reflected on the types of demands, the types of struggles that people were asking in that particular time, and wondered why land and property and ownership was not a central part of those conversations. And it forced us to reflect and recover history, particularly with African-American people, Black people in the United States, that there was a legacy of land ownership and property ownership coming right out of the end of the period of enslavement. That was critical in Reconstruction in the early years, in the midst of tremendous duress, and how many of those systems had eroded and gone away, and uncovered that many of those property and land development decisions by Black folks were due to cooperative models and cooperative structures of ownership. And so since I'm not a practitioner, I'm going to try to offer another lens, which is there are communities that have a legacy and a connection with the built environment tied to cooperation, tied to communal work that we often don't visualize and bring up front. And I think that as we start to think in terms of what practitioners' roles might be, it's also a time to revisit how communities have pursued this and prosecuted this in previous times. And so we've talked about ownership, we talk about land use, we talk about information, which I think we've seen a lot of illustration in the presentations previous to this one, the challenges and the issues associated with that, technology access, and broadening that definition of wealth so that in a capitalist society, it's hard to not talk about, the centrality of the monetary value of places and things, but that we have other pieces of wealth. And so our previous presentation with Designing Justice, Designing Spaces talked about health and well-being and other aspects that could be constituted as wealth. So Julian and I wrote an article. So the idea of, is it time to revisit this idea of the Black Commons? And we'll talk a bit more about what that means. But the two components are cooperatives, as we were discussing in this section, but also community land trusts, which in the United States have some connection to the continuation of the civil rights movement and the project of equal rights tied to equal access to land for our growth and our betterment. In the case of Black communities and African-American communities, this comes to us from Mindy Fuller Thompson, who wrote a very influential book called Root Shock, which talks about the psychological impacts of losing one's home place through displacement. So we invoked our indigenous ancestors at the beginning of the talk. Of course, they lead the charge in terms of colonialism and the removal and extermination of people from our continent, the North American continent. But with the enslavement of African-American people, these periods of what she called serial displacement from slavery through the Jim Crow era ending in Reconstruction, through redlining, through urban renewal, through freeway construction. Every generation, there's a shock to the system that displaces people, and that there are cumulative costs to that, in addition to the physical costs, psychological costs in terms of a lack of attachment to particular places, or the struggle with maintaining attachment to places from which you can accrue wealth, you can accrue a sense of meaning, you can accrue a sense of identity. So we have sort of a serial pattern there, and it came to a head, last summer, when we saw, tragically, through a virally shared video, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. But one backstory about George Floyd is that although he was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, not far from where I am right now, he lived his early life and graduated from high school in Houston, Texas, and went to a high school named after a gentleman on the screen, Reverend Jack Yates, who immediately after emancipation, well, actually 2 years after emancipation, we just came through Juneteenth. So if you're Black or have connections to Black culture in the United States, you understand the significance of that date, that holiday. 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Black people in Texas learned that they were no longer enslaved. So they were enslaved for 2 years, or acted like they were enslaved, didn't know, but it was announced when Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas. To honor that, there's a holiday that is now a national holiday called Juneteenth. And to recognize that, one of the first cooperatives by Black people in the United States was founded in Houston, Texas through Jack Yates Church. They acquired 12 acres of land in downtown Houston in the 3rd Ward to create Emancipation Park, a park whose sole purpose was to celebrate Juneteenth every year, a gathering for African Americans across the region and across the country to celebrate freedom, which exists today. And it's important to note that this park precedes the Houston public park system. It's the first public park in Houston. It was founded as a cooperative land agreement by Black people and built by Black people before the advent of the popularization of the technical fields. The image you see now is after it's been redone by what was then the Freeline Group. Phil Freeline, its founder, has recently passed away, but it exists today and maintains as an anchor. So these communities have these histories where we work, and I'm wondering and like to put out there on the table the interest and the willingness of people like us, practitioners, as we form our ideas of what collective work may mean for our professions, is also to learn from the communities for whom we're serving and see what works. There's an excellent book which we put in the optional readings, Jessica Nemhardt's book with Collective Courage, which talks about this era after Reconstruction in the United States, where there were 10,000 cooperatives owned by Black people around the country in the early 20th century in the midst of incredible disrepair and harm. Also documented and attempted to proliferate this model throughout Black communities recently out of enslavement was W.B. Du Bois, who was the first Black graduate from Harvard and who pioneered many of the tools of sociology, which we see represented in many of the projects that have been talked about in this panel. You may use in your own work. His work in the Philadelphia Negro in particular, studying African-American communities in Philadelphia, pioneered, these ideas of getting to know people, going door to door, building relationships, as was talked about in the previous study, and building an understanding of a place from a shared meaning, understanding the people that are there. So in the early 20th century, there was a lot of innovation with cooperatives, and we also have come up upon the 100th anniversary of the bombing of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood district. And if you don't know about that, a lot of people were introduced to that idea through an HBO show called The Watchmen, which was actually a continuation of a comic book series speculating on sort of different futures. But the opening scene was the first visualization that many people had ever seen of what happened, where hundreds of people were murdered through racial violence in what was then known as Black Wall Street, the most prosperous Black business district in the nation. Was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and many of those businesses were founded, established, and built through cooperative ownership, the models that have been talked about today. Not all of them were destroyed. So where I live now, in Durham, North Carolina, had a Black Wall Street as well. It was the home of Mechanics and Farmers Bank and NC Mutual life insurance companies, which until 1960 employed the most Black people in the United States on a tiny street in a small southern town. Both places were built on the cooperative model, and they used that to fund the development of their infrastructure, the buildings, the streets, and everything. Moving to the other part of the Commons, the community land trust model, Fannie Lou Hamer, leader of the Mississippi Freedom Party, part of the Democratic, an insurgent who challenged the Democratic Party that didn't allow her to have her voice, representing poor rural people and really across Mississippi, pioneered some of the things we think about now in terms of community land trusts, at least in the United States. The image on the right is her pig bank. The idea that it's more common now in terms of shared ownership of meat producing animals that can replicate. You can share the babies amongst other people and continue to build people's health and build their wealth. She kind of figured this out ad hoc on her own, but it expanded into the idea of declaring a huge part of southwestern Georgia as one of the original community land trusts in the United States, which gave birth to the Schumacher Center, who codified community land trusts for the United States. So if you're using a community land trust model in the United States, you're using language that came from these folks. So people like Charles Sherrod and Robert Swan and many others who literally saw this as an extension of the political project that was put forward by the civil rights movement. That it's important for some people to know that Black people were not treated as full citizens and protected under the letter of law until 1965. So I think a lot of people think after 1863, after emancipation, that's the period where that clock starts. But no, until the Voting Rights Act passes in 1865, didn't have equal protections. So people at that time saw the insufficiency of just a political project. They saw the value of owning land, owning property as a part of that work. I'll close out with two short stories, one a little longer than the other. Rondo in St. Paul, Minnesota, a thriving African-American community largely built through the implementation of Du Bois' systematic research on cooperative business models that he popularized in the early part of the 20th century. That was destroyed by the siting of a freeway, I-94. So for people like me, I'm from Detroit. I-94 goes through the city of Detroit as well. It went through here as well and targeted this particular community and destroyed it through public policy. Through a process of celebrating that local history and elevating it, that community started to push back in terms of, hey, let's talk about this history. Let's rebuild these cooperatives and find ways to collectively create spaces for us to share these stories. This is a museum that was built there. It's an outdoor and an indoor facility that can also be used for community use. That helps people understand what that particular story is. And there are more robust plans, which are to heal that wound that was created by the freeway by going right over it with the plaza and the deck and actually rebuilding that business district where it was before, right on top of the freeway as it pushed back. So in some cases, this idea of the cooperative tied to the land trust, this is also a land trust owned sort of entity and effort, enabled them to then start to go at the particular harms that caused the disintegration of the particular community in the first place, in this case, public policy tied to freeways. And the last one, which might be more accessible to this particular audience, is some of the work from a friend and a colleague, Justin Garrett Moore, who's a native of Indianapolis, and is really in this picture standing in his former neighborhood, his ancestral land, where his grandfather in particular was very active in building collaborative and collective work. This introduces the idea of a digital part of the commons, which is to say that we've talked about a lot of physical things, a lot of first-person things, tangible built things. In terms of sharing information and resources, the innovations of the internet and other things allow us to do things we couldn't do before. So this urban patch model that he came up with to crowdsource the funding of infrastructure projects, of green space projects, of new things, has really been pioneering in a lot of regards. And he used that as a way to build resources in his particular hometown, returning to his old neighborhood access to food. So this bodega was fully funded by people, the majority who'd never been in Indianapolis, right? And he didn't have any first-person relationship with this particular project, but because of the way that it was characterized and shared through social media, enacted something of community benefit. So it opens up this idea of commons to even beyond the individual stakeholders that are within a particular geography. There are ways of using technology now to open that up to people who may have other interests and other ideas. So I'll say thank you, and we'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. As Natalie said, we went a little bit over time, so we'll skip the breakout rooms and do Q&A strictly through Stack. So you all know the drill. So if you want to ask a question, put your name in Stack and I'll keep it. Maybe I'll start us off because this has been sort of a burning thought for me. And it's a question for everybody, but maybe primarily the first part for Kofi and the second for Garrett. So in Stavridis, we sort of read about how commoning can actually sort of assist the capitalist project of enclosure by creating enclaves and closed communities. And so when we live in a society where so many injustices have yet to be righted, so many inequalities to be rectified, sort of how to reconcile the ultimate desire to have a very open-ended community with the need to first create specifically a Black commons. And then for Garrett, in a similar vein, we saw a lot of criticism in the readings about how the commons is so frequently seen, especially by Ostrom, as an economic construct, but in essence, commoning needs to be first and foremost a social and political project in order to transform our society drastically. And so, Garrett, you spoke about building new businesses through relationships and identities. And so I want to ask, how do we know that we're actually making a difference versus just finding a more effective way of doing business, sort of exploiting an opening in the market in a time where social awareness is sort of on the rise?
Garrett, did you want to go first, or?
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a really good question. You know, there's a data point that I didn't share that I think puts some of this in perspective. So at the end of the Civil War and during Reconstruction, Black people and African Americans actually owned a lot of land. They weren't able to go all the way in terms of what we call reparations, the whole anecdote of 40 acres to do, but there were a number of resources available. And through violence, regional violence from white people, white communities, racial intimidation, but also through policy, through the USDA, right, the Department of Agriculture. Today, if we do the count, particularly in rural land, African-American Black people own about 2% of what they owned formerly. The biggest cause for that loss is air rights and property rights. So for people who may be aware of this, if you don't have a will or you haven't made a decision about who actually owns property and you pass away, every living heir owns a share of that particular property. And so rather than the USDA helping communities with the legal components of that so they can keep it in property, then people exploited, that air right loophole to basically take land from African Americans. There's no census for urban land because there was the great migration of Black people from the rural South to northern cities that happened in the early 20th century. But most sources that I've seen say it's less than 10% of urban land. So you're dealing with 2% of rural land and 10% of urban land. And in some cases directly due to the consequences of public policy. So that definition of Black to commons was intentional. It was originally put forward by the Schumacher Center. They were the first ones to use that particular term. And they were talking about imagining a national network, a land bank, essentially, a community land trust bank where people could donate land wherever they are geographically in the United States within one unit. And what Julian and I have tried to sort of build from that foundation is what you all are dealing with which is cooperative work in those systems. So that idea of restricting it to the context of Black people in America, that was intentional. But hopefully there are some lessons and some transferability to that particular story to wherever other folks are from.
Tackle the other question. Thanks, Kofi. And these are all things we're constantly dealing with at Designing Justice, Designing Spaces. What does it mean for DJDS to own land, to operate it as a Black owned and operated firm? And I think it's a good question of whether we're exploiting the opportunities, but the question is also about who's benefiting from these opportunities and who is becoming the business owners, who is gaining access to capital, who is gaining access to spaces of bureaucracy that are traditionally made to keep people out, who is building new capacity to get access to those spaces, like pulling permits, getting business licenses. How are we being intentional about how we're setting this up, which is something we've done through the pop-up village, of really wanting to build capacity for new entrepreneurs, to build access so that they can start building generational wealth. And really, how are we learning from the past, from cooperatives, as Kofi described a lot of, in West Oakland, I participated in a lot of Afrofuturist cooperative meetings around the pop-up village on how we're creating new business types that are not just replicating models of sole ownership, but rather creating new types of shared ownership and shared asset management. But it's a good question, because sometimes it's hard, right? Like DJDS, we just bought our first land, which is an incredible move for the organization in Detroit. And we're trying to figure out how to open up the dialogue around community ownership and investment in these properties. And Kofi gave a great example of Justin Garrett Moore's urban patch of crowdsource funding. But in a lot of the finances that are available to fund real estate development projects, they exclude you from the ability to crowdsource. And so how do you actually create large structures while taking advantage of some of the financing tools that are available without excluding yourself from building these new models? And so something that I'm constantly struggling with is, as prison abolitionists, we are about creating the new systems, right? And breaking down the ones we know don't work. But along the way, if we can help some organization or group of people gain access to building capital and building generational wealth within a system we know is broken, do we spend more energy doing that, or do we spend more energy building the new systems? And where do we really put all our efforts, and how do we balance that? So it's a great question, and one we're constantly dealing with.
Ada?
So I think the base of my question was actually touched on a little bit in those two answers, which is very cool. I was curious about the legal, which was sort of touched on, but also if any of the presenters had found maybe like physical forms that lend themselves to cooperative operation, like if you were going to design a building with that in mind, like, are there like physical forms as well as legal structures that lend themselves to cooperation, or particular methodologies you found in organizing spaces that lend themselves to cooperation and non-privatization better than others?
Maybe I can just answer from from the last part of the question about more kind of about the spaces. I'm not sure about if there is forms that enhance kind of the interaction more than others. Well, I have the feeling, or kind of I have tested, but what has been more challenging, at least for us, is, as you were also saying, how to, in a way, challenge and redefine certain regulations. Because, for example, in the field of housing, at least in the Spanish context, it's really regulated, from even the language of a room, which is always kind of really hierarchical and patriarchal. So all the time, it's from the kind of the concepts in terms of even the legal, the framework, the finance, etc., to the architecture. And in terms of the architecture, the regulation is something that it's in a way limiting a lot. So in our case, and even because normally there is kind of what we call it, even in the Spanish, it's kind of curious because we call it common space to the stairs, the elevator, and the installations, for example, and the rest is kind of the units. So this idea to introduce community spaces for the community use is something that has not been regulated. So for us, more that the form and the space itself, I think that, of course, there is an instrumentality in terms of impact, in terms of the social kind of dynamics, but what is challenging is to discuss with the technicians about what these kind of projects are looking for. But at least our experience, because there is a cooperative behind, because there is a group of people with a certain specific profile and needs, there is kind of a better kind of openness. So it's always different when you are challenging to not build a parking because they don't have cars and they want to implement a new kind of mobility model, because there is a kind of a real kind well, it's because based on real needs, no? So this is also something that for us has been interesting. I don't know if I really answer part of the question, but well, I think it's something that it's always present on kind of the bureaucratic frameworks.
Thanks.
Catherine? Oh, sorry, Ada, did you have a follow-up?
No, I was just saying thanks. That did get to a bit of what I was asking.
I also have a
Go ahead, Garrett.
A quick resource in the East Bay Community Law Center is a legal organization working to build frameworks for establishing cooperative entities. So they're kind of working on the corporate structure of that. So I'd look into them, East Bay CLC.
Thank you. Catherine raised her hand instead of saying stack, but I think Catherine, you're next.
Hi, so let me turn my camera. Sorry, I'm in the car. Yeah, so I guess this question is kind of to do with Palmyra's first question and some of the comments that were made kind of throughout the lectures, directly or indirectly, about the nonprofit industrial complex. But I'm thinking not so much in terms of like our motivations, more so in terms of the way that like labor towards community building has itself become professionalized and like turned into like its own sort of profession. And it was interesting to hear Emancipation Park mentioned. I just graduated from University of Houston, so I've lived in Third Ward, like a few blocks away from that park, for like 5 or 6 years, and I'm involved in some community organizations in the neighborhood. And yeah, the way that park was renovated, like through tax increment reinvestment zone and like these kind of very bureaucratic like public processes, led to a lot of like distrust from the community and just like weird feelings like of not having ownership. You know, it closes at dark now, people can't gather there, like et cetera, et cetera. It's been very much like turned into a much more, not to mention like the gentrification that the park itself has caused with like townhomes kind of going up all around it, since it's now this like great community amenity. And I'm just kind of wondering, I don't know, I guess I'm just wondering, sorry, I'm rambling, like what is the cost of getting paid to do this work? And like, how does professionalization play into labor that is intended to benefit communities and historically has been done for free, or even been done by people who are paying salaries from other like professions into that work. I don't know if that makes sense, or if y'all understand what I'm saying. But yeah, just the professionalization of community development, I guess. Like, what does that do?
Magali, you're muted. So I think you were trying to say something earlier and I didn't understand.
I think that there's the only thing that I can say, and I'm sorry that I missed part of the question because I had to find a way of stopping the phone from ringing. But I think the only thing that I could say is that professionals must establish trust, especially in what this young woman asked, the professionalization of community development. That's something new. In general, we call community organizers. They're paid, of course, but it's hardly something that is a profession in the sense that I established. They don't have a particular market. But professionals always have a problem of trust. And in the United States, at this moment, there's a tremendous reaction against expertise of any kind because it has been politically instrumentalized. So you have to instrumentalize it back by constructing trust. And the only way in which I see that you can construct trust is by establishing this participatory framework that allows people to tell you what they think you're doing wrong. But professionals, when they come from outside, have a basic barrier to surmount, and it's to establish who are their clients. And I don't think the question was that clear to me because I had to leave the room for a moment. But it's always the same question of what new form are you going to establish where your clients can feel that they have a voice, and your clients in this case is a community that perhaps is rent by all sorts of contradictory ambitions, like the ambition of owning. And apropos the collapse of the condo in Florida, I heard the most common reaction that I heard is, I would never participate in a condominium. So you're maintaining the idea of private property, individual private property of a house, because the moment that you share, you have the problems that we have seen emerged. Now, those problems that emerged were obvious with the kind of property that was, but at a larger level, I think that it illustrates that the ideal forms that people have in their minds are not necessarily those that the community organization or the cooperative is trying to push forward. And it's difficult to react to those schemes. So I don't know if I made any sense, but it seems to me that the only answer that one has is participation, and having people express what it is that they mistrust, what it is that they want and they're not getting, and what they would like to have. And maybe at some point, if what they want is a little private house, for instance, they will have to leave. That's not what this particular project is offering. And Garrett can talk to that about his pop-up villages. Maybe if what they want is a little school, they're not going to accept a bus that comes and helps the kids with their schooling. So you cannot include everybody, if you're not giving them something they want. But it's going to be a more restricted community. Cristina is working, it seems to me, with a very fertile soil, because the tradition of cooperativism in community in Catalonia in particular and in Spain in general is so strong, and Spain has exported it to the whole world. I mean, people go not to Catalonia, but to the Basque country to visit Mondragon. And Mondragon is truly an economic power, in fact, at this point. But
well, I also wanted to say regarding this question, because in La Col, for example, as of course we have a salary and we are paid for part of our work, we also understand that there is some kind of work really linked to the neighborhood where we are part. For example, all about Camballo, not the cooperatives and not the specific project, but yes, more about even activism as a kind of one neighbor. And this is something that we are doing as a non-paid. So there's always a kind of a balance, about 30-70%, where we understand that also being part of the different networks allows us to help and give kind of a skills. And we don't ask and we don't want a kind of economical return. So I think it's all, and we have been working by the municipality and we have been working by cooperatives. And I think this is something really important. This kind of the different kind of conditions and which is the role of the work. And for us, it's always really important to define from the beginning what are they looking for, which are kind of the conditions, especially when you are working by the municipality, to define who has the control and if there is something that all the decisions taken in the participatory process by the community are going to be defended by the politicians. So basically, I think that you are touching a really, really important point. And as a technicians, I think that we are always kind of transiting and moving in kind of different kind of even kind of social and even kind of different ecosystems, and each community, each territory is really different. So this is something that we have to be aware and understand with who you are talking, and who are invited on the tables always, no? So I think that there is no kind of a receipt, a kind of a specific response, but we have been moving the past 10 years with different projects, and it's always really challenging. No?
If I may add something, it seems to me that what I was trying to say is that if you have a participatory let's not call a community anything, but if you have a participatory form of organization, which includes your team and your clients, and the clients themselves are self-organized, they came together, they called you, they talked to the municipality, etc. Then those who do not want that project should clearly be ruled out, because they are only going to destroy the project. And in what I had given you to read, the article by Eric Wright in Jacobin on how to be an anti-capitalist in the 21st century, well, we're not going to smash capitalism. And so he argues that either you flee it to some ideal land, or you erode it. And you erode it by giving different examples of what could be. You know, one of the examples that Eric Wright, who was my great friend and died last year, one of the examples that he gives up in the United States are public libraries. You should have seen how people arose, mobilized to defend our libraries. Well, of course, the municipality, the administration of Mayor Nutter at that time, didn't learn very much. I remember when somebody asked the managing director or the finance director, what did you learn of the movement to defend the libraries? You know what he answered? Well, that you can close the swimming pools, but not the libraries. Now, there is one reason you cannot close the libraries, is because people see it very much as a cooperative institution as a community institution, the pools are not open all the time, and the pools involve something very different. But of course, they had learned what you should not touch, okay, when they are trying to make the poor neighborhoods pay for deficiencies in the budget, which they always do. But to go back to the initial question, I think that if you're going to have a participatory structure, that's what Cristina said, you also have to be very aware of the people who have no place in it because they don't want it. They don't want the same thing that the majority wants. That's a sort of, I mean, we learn it in the United States every day that there's no way you're going to talk to Trump supporters. So try to convince the independents who haven't made up their mind yet, but there are people whom you're not going to reach in any way.
Coming in from a public library as we speak, Will, I think, has two questions. One from Magali and one from Kofi.
I've only got the one. Magali already sort of answered the other one. So this one's for Kofi. A while ago, I read a book called The Undercommons. That was about Black capital and different structures in it. And the authors critiqued universities as being sort of a pipeline to convert independent students to agents of the state. So in your opinion, during the George Floyd protests, do you think universities as a whole were more on the side of the state or on the side of their communities?
Wow. I think this is another ABC class session topic. The universities are always on the side of the universities. Where they align with either structure is university by university. I'll give an example with my home university, NC State University. It's a publicly funded university with a mandate of creating new knowledge, teaching best practices, and sharing those with our state, people across the state through extension. So I went to University of Michigan, which is another public university, but had no community mandate at all. Pretty much an ivory tower, and so it was sort of catch as catch can in terms of independent faculty interest, but in terms of a university entity, you know, what side are they on? They're on their own side. So where it comes up with regards to issues like George Floyd, and, you know, the aftermath of that, for example, not as a university as a whole, but there were a number of us, faculty, students, and many others that were already participating in a lot of the protests and mobilization against mass incarceration and the increase of the police state and police violence. And we've had incidents in our own backyard in Raleigh that have not gotten national attention other than Reverend William Barber, who's in North Carolina, who's been protesting and getting arrested for these things in North Carolina for many, many, many years. So I would say that the university is always on the side of the university. And I think an interesting way of discussing that is what we're doing right now. Normally, as a college professor, we would make you pay $10,000 in tuition to do what we're doing right now, online, essentially for free, right? So the universities are in a very interesting position right now in terms of coming out of a year and a half of everyone cooperatively sharing knowledge, making information free, building new networks to connect with new people without that surrogate of the university as the platform to allow you to be able to do that, right? That you've kind of taken away the middleman. You can get access to information now. You can get access if you need training. You don't actually technically have to go to university unless, with regards to architecture, you need an accredited degree in order to sit for the licensing exam, right? Which goes back to Magali's original point about the justification of the profession. But I can't, across the board, sort of characterize universities and where they align with community versus with the state. I can just say that universities are essentially corporations, even public ones, and they align with themselves.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's when you put it as corporations, that makes a lot of sense, actually. But it just reminded me that didn't we have snipers from the police on the roof of the architecture building Aaron, can you speak to that? Well, anyway, we had snipers from the cops on the roof of the architecture building, and that was interesting. And I don't know how it was resolved, but I'd be interested to know whether the university was forced into that by the state or whether they did that willingly.
Aaron responded in the chat. Peggy, I think you're up next.
Hi. I wanted to ask Magali a kind of blunt question. I have always used your work, which I totally admire. The rise of the professionalism for me was very inspiring, but I have really taken it to be an argument against professionalization for various reasons. 19th century construction that's not appropriate to the 21st century, permeates an idea of elitism, which isn't helpful, keeps boundaries against people who we actually want to be talking to, blah, blah, blah. But both your readings for today and your talk, which really says that if professionalism is truly doing its work, builds trust, concentrates on the firm, admits all the players who are really participating in this, the professionalism and the architectural profession in particular is a reasonable structure for a collective, for a commons. So I'm curious to know, do we have a positive feeling about what professionalism does, or can I continue with my critique of architecture?
No, I'm sorry, I don't see your name without putting my glasses on.
Peggy.
Peggy. Oh, Peggy, we were writing to each other.
Yeah, way back when. Yeah,
but way back then. But look, we don't have to be one thing or the other. I think that we use the word professional to mean it's well done, right? Something is well done. We live in Trump's America, and Trump didn't invent anything. So we're not going to put down certain criteria of work well done or of truth established. When I was writing The Rise of Professionalism, I was responding to a narrative that was incredibly elogious and incredibly praising professions. And he did the same thing that I think Gary Stevens and even Paul Jones and those people do towards architecture. You participate in the delusions of professionals instead of participating in what they do that is real. And I said, the profession for me is professionalism is a market project, but since it has to have a public, then it has to use anti-market principles. So it's not one thing or the other. I think that professionalism involves people, or should, you don't know at this point because professional and expert are merging, right, Peggy? And you cannot distinguish a professional who still has a sense, well, I must respond to people who have the same ways of getting to knowledge or getting to my practice that I have. That's, in a sense, is what defines a professional. But an expert knows and owns his or her expertise, right? And uses it as she or he wants. So the more we move towards only professions being only experts, and adding to it, the more you become one single unitary thing that is hard to defend, except insofar as we defend knowledge that doesn't come from Fox News or the internet, and that's the problem. The internet is immensely democratic, and 90% of it is crap. So you cannot say that knowledge that is open to all ends up in truly positive knowledge. I think that you have to maintain a certain elitist position. I'm sorry, but people who did the work and what should be open is the access to knowledge. But that you find knowledge in the World Wide Web, I don't know. That you find knowledge in the social media, or in Facebook, is very contestable, isn't it?
I guess I think of professionalism as not as a opportunity for experts, which is problematic, but it's state licensure. And so one could think about something like certification, which is regulated by those who practice it as opposed to by the state. And so there's another way of kind of guaranteeing quality work. But anyway, this is, you and I can
where you and I can write to each other or call each other. But I think it's very important what you said, and I'm critical of my own work. I was trying to say to tell a different story, a story that was debunking this myth of profession that the sociology of professions maintained. But I wouldn't have, then I was accused of being a monster and of destroying professionalism and of destroying good work and all those things. But thank you.
I know we have 3 more people on stack. So Joshua, James, and Will. If you have burning questions, we can actually sort of send them to the speakers directly. But I'm going to have to cut it off to keep us on time. So it's an awful job that I have to end this discussion. But I also want to we're already at 5 p.m., but just want to thank our speakers immensely for their presentations, the sharing of knowledge, the thoughtful positions, not all of which were perfectly aligned with one another, which have made it very interesting. And I want to sort of take an opportunity to sort of give the floor to our saloners, because this is also the time when we introduce the assignments. So just a very, very quick reminder, next Saturday, we will be reviewing your assignments. The assignment is already live in the syllabus document. We will also be holding office hours again on Wednesday. Make sure you know that this time there are 3 office hours instead of 2, and they're at different times. You can find the times on the syllabus. And so at this point, I would just like to give the floor to our saloners. They are Caitlin Boniecki, Frank Burge, who I would like to say is also the person responsible for the really wonderful graphics you see in the background, as well as on the schedule on the website, and Will Martin. So take it away, guys.
Thank you, Palmyra, and thank you so much to all the speakers for your wonderful presentations. Really interesting. So I'll just be brief because this information is available on the syllabus sheet, but the assignment which we're doing between now, and the salon next weekend involves, while the capitalism assignment was really about tracing power relations and economic relations enmeshing objects, or the kind of what of capitalism, and the labor assignment was about the who, understanding situation and qualities of laboring workers. This collectives assignment is really about how we organize into collective bodies in architecture, and how these collectives share or don't share, protect resources. So the assignment part is just about choosing a kind of an overarching architectural organization, and then defining a specific collective within that organizational category, and listing some of the really important resources that are important and are either shared or protected by that collective. So if I can share my screen, you see a Miro with an example here. So part 1 is to choose one of these collectives. So you start by defining a collective. You can choose from academia, professional practice, the public, a firm, a place-based community, or an identity-based community. And we kind of recommend choosing an organization type that you're directly involved with, which will make for better assignment and salon outcomes. And we'll just there'll be a task to diagram that collective and who's in and out, and then do a bit of resource mapping of a specific example of that type of collective. And so that resource mapping will involve listing some of the resources that are important, and then mapping them out on a grid of whether those resources are rivalrous, non-rivalrous, and excludable or non-excludable, which are 4 important categories for kind of analyzing access and the protection or sharing of resources. And then when we meet in the salon next week, we're going to be doing slightly different salon to what has been done formally. We're actually going to be analyzing a particular resource as a commons using this toolkit called the Commons Identikit. And then we'll be creating commoning action plans, so strategizing together about ways we might common particular resources in your context. So I will stop sharing and open up to Will or Caitlin if they'd like to add anything to that.
I don't have anything to add. I think we're still going to break out into little groups here if everyone's still interested. Just to kind of, if you're interested in working in small groups of 5 or less, instead of working individually, we can separate you, or you can pop into these 6 different groups that Frank had mentioned. And you can meet people and kind of team up, exchange information so you can collaborate throughout the week. And we'll keep the main room here open if you have more questions about the assignment. So otherwise, I guess the session is over for the day, and thank you for attending again. And we really look forward to seeing you next week at our office hours on Wednesday. You can find the hours in the syllabus and at the salon.